I'm David Smith. I know some, but not all of you. I've ended up going to the 11 or the 5 over the last several years. I've been a parishioner for about 20 years at St. Mary's. My wife, Leslie Ann Gerardo, has also been a parishioner here for 20 years. And so what we're going to do in the next 40 minutes is to describe who we are, what the ministry is, and to offer it to the congregation, to you, and hope that it provides something for you to become involved with. And Susan Cunningham is here and going to present. Dennis Carter-Chand is here and going to present. And I'm going to talk about who we are, what the ministry is, and the framework of the Episcopal Church that has given us a path forward to do this. We are, in fact, not leading in some respects. We are actually following some of the path that the larger Episcopal Church has laid out. Our ministry aims to help us live in our baptismal covenant. This is part of our mission statement. Find creative, meaningful, and active ways to seek racial reconciliation and strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. That's part of our baptismal covenant. That's pretty well known to us, hard to do, easy to say. I think if you take it seriously, as people of faith have for a long time, it's pretty radical. If every single life is worth the same as every other life, that would have an impact on each of our lives. How would we actually implement that? Ideally, come up with a way to internalize it and accept it, and to move outward with it. We don't have any advocacy piece. We're not saying that you should do anything in particular, vote a particular way, but what we want is to have each person launch on a spiritual journey to think about these issues, because they are deep issues. Racism is a deeply entrenched fact of American society. It impacts essentially everything we do, I believe. And you can look at it on a superficial level, or I think you're much better off if you have an understanding of what goes beyond it, or how it came to be. So our approach is to create space to listen and share, to better understand racism and inequity, and to support parishioners' individual Christian spiritual journeys. The way we see the ministry is both an internal within St. Mary's and an external ministry. So I also want to talk about the word racism. Certainly, we understand racism, or a racist person, to be someone who believes that people who look different than we do, people of color, are inherently inferior. That's odious, it's obvious. There are still people like that in our society. What we're focusing on as much or more is institutional racism, which is the underlying forces that cause people to be separated and cause inequity. And they are long-standing and deep-seated. And it takes some thought to understand them. And again, I don't profess to be an expert by any means, but the more I've become interested and the more I've read about it, the more stunning it becomes. Banking industry, the real estate industry, early in the 20th century were explicitly racist. I had been an attorney with the Department of Justice for 25 years, and initially started out as a federal prosecutor in the District of Columbia, and learned about the damage that crime does to communities that are downtrodden in particular. As a prosecutor, I was all about individual accountability. I mean, yes, you might have had a bad childhood, but that doesn't really matter when you come to killing somebody or doing something horrible. But at the same time, why is it that there are so many folks of color who are incarcerated? And the first time I heard mass incarceration, I really bristled, because as a prosecutor, it made me feel like, wait a minute, you're saying that I didn't take care of each individual case that I prosecuted? Because I did. I was very, clear with the process. They got a fair trial, they got a fair plea, whatever. And I bristled at it. But mass incarceration is a term that's out there that does look at the facts that, for instance, drug prosecutions, there are many, many more people of color who are prosecuted. When statistically, it's believed that whites and blacks and others use drugs at the same basic rate. So why is that? And there are a lot of factors, and we can't go into all of it, but it just got me curious about why things are the way they are. All right. One of the other things we're going to hope to do is collaborate with our neighbors in Arlington, examine the collective history of racial and economic segregation, the framework that the Episcopal Church has already put together for us to look at this. Again, just reading a little bit about the issues of racism in the church is, its history is checkered, and I feel, frankly, blessed to be able to say that, and because our clergy is so free and open-minded. But when you look at the history of the Christian church writ large, and even the Episcopal Church, I mean, it's very checkered. In coming down the road, we hope to be able to put together what the Episcopal Church calls dialogue circles, which would be small groups of 6 to 8 people, led by folks from the Moore group or anybody who wants to do it, to talk about the issues. And the Episcopal Church actually has 10 specific sessions of video and other information and readings that really, and it's not just about African Americans, it's with respect to Hispanic, Native Americans, any people, non-white peoples, and it's about white and Caucasian people too, and what the impact is on us. It's not about guilt. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Susan Cunningham.
I would just share a little bit of my journey from beloved community. I grew up in a really small, really white town where the diversity was whether you raised chickens or you raised cows. And then went to college in New Haven and came right to DC, where I spent a lot of time in the district working with neighborhoods and schools. And at that time, the district was still the chocolate city, and it always felt weird to me to go back home where there was no racial diversity. Fast forward, Philip and I got married and had these little children and needed to settle down, and we found ourselves sort of inadvertently. We thought we were going to South Arlington. We ended up in North Arlington, and a long time after that came to St. Mary's. So my beloved community kind of went from very, very rural and white to very mixed and unusually so for the district, and then back to North Arlington, which is still a little bit startling to me in how undiverse it is in pockets. So that is my background. So I just wanted to share a little vignette. I can tell stories afterwards, but about kind of where we are sitting in Arlington. So Arlington has had a history of certainly Native Americans from very long ago right here, and more recently, 1600s and beyond, African Americans. There was a farm right here that St. Mary's was adjacent to, before St. Mary's existed, that certainly had slaves that would work there. And this is a quick map of Arlington, pointer. St. Mary's is sort of between Halls Hill and Pelhamtown, and many of these little circles don't exist anymore. They were wiped out during the creation of the Pentagon, the National Cemetery, but Green Valley, Johnson's Hill, and Halls Hill were enclaves of African American communities that do still exist in some fashion. And Halls Hill is the one that's closest to us. It was anchored by 2 churches that are still very much operational. Both were started in the 1850s, 60s. And the top one is Callaway, and the bottom is Mount Salvation. They're right off of the highway near Culpeper Street. Fast forward into the next century, and Arlington, though slavery certainly had moved on, there were a great deal of very physical as well as financial and legal separations to maintain segregation in Arlington. In the 20s, the Ku Klux Klan was already very, very active. They had a cross-burning field where the Ballston Mall is now. So every Sunday afternoon after church, you'd go out and practice your cross-burning. They also sponsored a baseball team and other things. By the 30s, Bellevue Forest, which is just down 26th Street where we hit Military Road, had specific real estate covenants written in that you could not live there, you could not own, you could not lease, you could not live in a house unless you were the domestic servant of a white owner. And then in Halls Hill, which again is one of those historically African American communities from 1850s on, they were not getting fire service or emergency service from the county. So you call your house is on fire, no one who would come. So they established their own volunteer fire department. They raised all the money for buildings. They paid all the money for buildings. They paid their, they raised the money for the volunteers. That was not, they were not paid until 10 years after every other fire station. And then they didn't get new equipment until they were integrated in the 60s. And then finally, the Halls Hill segregation wall, a piece of which still is in place, was built in the 30s as the homes began to be developed in Woodlawn, and the county allowed, some say encouraged, the white owners to put up fences and walls, which remained again until the late 60s when school integration finally forced the issue of elementary school students having to walk 15 blocks around the wall. School segregation and desegregation is sort of did lead some of the issues in Arlington. We are in Virginia, which is known to be one of the most challenged places of getting through desegregation. So Brown versus Board of Ed was in '54. Virginia, at the leadership of the governor and the elected officials for 5 years, voted to close schools rather than allow them to be integrated. So many schools and many children lost 5 years of education in parts of the county. In Arlington, there was, we are farther north, and there was some push and some tension to integrate, but again, being part of Virginia, there was a force back that took away our elected school board, that made it very difficult to move forward. By '58, there was an attempt to integrate Stratford, which is now Ham Middle School, in the fall, and they were turned away. And then in the spring of '59, with 100 riot-armed police officers on call, the school was integrated by 4 children. And the best headline is the day nothing happened, because certainly at that time, many things were happening in Little Rock and others, and there was anticipation that it could be violent, but it was not. Longer story, but of course, like desegregation, getting 4 children into a school is not the same as integration, and we are nowhere near integration today. It took even till '71 before the schools were arguably integrated. It was very, very slow. Black children could not participate in sports or after-school activities or in any fashion in the school. It would really just go in, get out, and you could have just the classes. And then likewise, many other exclusions, including VHC Hospital, which well into the 60s, you still could not share rooms between races without an explicit agreement that you had signed up for that. In the 60s also, within sort of a half mile of St. Mary's, there were multiple sit-ins at multiple locations. So along Old Dominion, the Cherrydale Drug Fair, and then also Lee Highway and Howard Johnson's, and that was part of beginning to turn the tide beyond schools. So then today, I think the Post said, America's more diverse than ever, but still incredibly segregated. And if you look at these maps, the one on the left shows concentrations by race, and the one on the right shows diversity. And if you look for us in Arlington County, we're kind of up above the N in Arlington County. We are one of the bright reds, which is very white, and one of the bright purples, which is very undiverse. And obviously, as you zoom out, that is not unique to us in North Arlington, in this community. It is the way, it is the legacy of various legal, financial, and human ways of living. And the consequences of that continue around us. We talked a bit about incarceration. In Virginia, it's 5 times more likely that you're in prison if you are Black. In Arlington, the Knock residence, which is one of the historically African American communities, is by far the most likely to be incarcerated, as if you grew up there. Health statistics are also very much affected by that stress. And education-wise, we are moving in terms of graduation rates are beginning to look better, but still a long way to go. But our suspension rates, which many would say is sort of the beginning of the school to prison pipeline, WNL is not unusual, but as an example, WNL has 9% Black students and 4% 43% of the suspensions are of Black students, which is unusual. It's typical, unfortunately, but it's notable. And then financial. If you grew up in, Bellevue Forest, your average salary has been $80,000. If you grew up in Knock, your average salary was $34,000. So that impact of all the racial covenants and other elements persists throughout people's lives.
Living at St. Mary's, I've been here about 18 months. Dennis Carter Chan, my wife Rebecca Carter Chan, and my daughter Ariana Carter Chan moved here from the city of Toronto. And in Toronto, we were part of a church that was really racially diverse. We had, it seemed like, representation from pretty much anyone in the world and people of all shades. So when I came to St. Mary's, it was a shock to be at a church where there's not much diversity, quite frankly. We chose St. Mary's as our church for a few reasons. First of all, people are so welcoming here, and also because of the church choir program for my daughter, and because of the traditional liturgy, which I really appreciated. I got involved with MORE for a number of reasons, but the first is that I noticed a real contrast between the churches I've been in Toronto, which were very multicultural and diverse, with all races, ethnicities, and shades of people represented, and St. Mary's, which is a white church in a neighborhood that is predominantly white. So I was wondering if it felt like this might be something intentional, but I really started to think about it maybe as a more nuanced reality that I needed to understand before passing any judgments. So MORE has been a good part of my journey to wrestle with this. So getting involved has been a way for me to understand the history of the Episcopal Church, the American Church, and its policy and perspective on racism. And I'm hoping that MORE can be not only just a part of a personal transformation as people wrestle with these issues, but part of a transformation of our church community and of a community even further than our church in our city of Arlington, which has definitely a history, as Susan showed us, of racial discrimination and tension, and more than that. So this is a way for our church, for St. Mary's, to grapple with these issues. And I'm so thankful that we have this space for that. So I hope you will be involved in MORE, that as many people in our parish who can make space for it will take time to be involved with MORE because of how important it is. There's many ways you can get involved. You can be part of the leadership team of MORE. We're always looking for more people to engage. I ask that everyone sincerely pray, reflect, and discern if this is a good fit for you, or if this is something that is something for you can engage at this time in your life. There's also a number of community organizations in Arlington and in Washington that I encourage you to get involved with. There's Challenging Racism, Voice, Lee Highway Alliance, Housing Arlington, Back on My Feet. Those are only some of them. You'll see up on the church website some links and a slide that has more details on this. In 2020, the church will be running dialogue circles, which are part of an Episcopal Church's program called Sacred Ground. There will be a 10-session program to give us an education and understanding of race and where the church is, and making progress with that. Thank you for being here during this morning's forum to hear David, Susan, and I talk about the ministry on race, reconciliation, and equity, and I encourage you to get involved.